Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Monticello live stream. Today, we are talking with Thomas Jefferson, as interpreted by Bill Barker. Our conversation today will focus on the unboxing of materials sent back from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Please add your questions in the comments and let us know where you're watching from.
Well, good afternoon, my friends. Once again, welcome to El Monticello. Such a pleasure to see you venture here during this summertime, though I will say that our summer has been somewhat mild thus far. It reminds me of the summer of 1805. I was here at this very time, all throughout August. I rarely remained in Washington City during the summer. Oh, my heavens, can you imagine with the pestilence of the swamp there, just beyond the south lawn of the president's house? So very, very warm. So I would usually take my leave in mid-July, and I would not return until about the beginning of October. I would leave Monticello the last week in September. And I have been bringing to mind that delightful occasion upon which, returning to the president's house, I was able to be greeted. May I refer to it as the treasure for a president? I'm referring, of course, to all of the crates, all of the cages, all of the trunks that were sent back by the Corps of Discovery, all packed by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark and their soldiers as they had wintered at Fort Mandan. That was the winter of 04-05. And so they packed the Keel boat full to send back all of these curiosities down the Missouri River. In fact, in a letter that he wrote me that April, it was written on the 7th of April, 1805, the day that they would then take leave and proceed onward up the Missouri, that they sent that day the keel boat backward, back down the Missouri, that I might see what they had thus far discovered. And well, that may be of curiosity for our conversation today. I was just reviewing the packing list, the manifest here of all that I've received, some of which I sent up to Charles Wilson Peel, other curiosities to the American Philosophical Society, and I will not deny I kept a few things for myself to adorn the entrance hall of the president's house and to adorn the entrance hall of Monticello. So I look forward to your questions that you might have about that occasion, the early years of that expedition led by our captain of the armies, Meriwether Lewis. So the floor is open. Anything you would like to put forth is my general interest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So I suppose a good place to begin this conversation would be to ask that, in your reflecting on your 2 terms as president, what were your feelings about commissioning the expedition led by Lewis and Clark?
Well, thank you. I remember distinctly what my concerns were. That is, having recently been elected and inaugurated the 3rd president of our nation, we had disparaging news from out west. Our right of deposit was denied us on the island of New Orleans. And this would bring to a halt, if you will, what we had considered for some time as free trade upon the Mississippi River. So taking up the office of president, I felt it necessary and my duty, protecting and defending our Constitution and our nation, that, well, I almost hesitate that perhaps we might conquer New Orleans, and thank heaven we did not do so. I will be ever grateful to the late Pierre Samuel Dupont for encouraging me not to do that, to flatter the French far more by offering to purchase. However, our immediate concern was also what other route of trade might we follow that could then access the rest of the world. And so that was when I decided later to go to Congress. That was January 18th, I believe, of the year 1803, and ask for support of a military reconnaissance to equip, if you will, our soldiers to try venturing up the Missouri River. And fortunately, our Congress allotted $2,500 to prepare and equip that expedition. So that was the initial concern for setting forth in discovery of another artery of commerce. And imagine that was commissioned in January 1803. Captain Lewis had been my private secretary from the beginning of when I took up residence in the president's house. So I could think of no other individual of courage undaunted who might lead that expedition other than Captain Lewis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Out of curiosity, how long did the preparations take before Lewis and Clark left Washington, before they went out?
I will tell you, I have often reflected upon the length of time it took to prepare that military expedition. It makes you realize when necessity is at the forefront, you will find some means to accomplish. It took but several months. Once we received that allotment of money, that January of 1803, then I set about immediately to welcome Captain Lewis to lead the expedition and to have him properly instructed as to particular pursuits of scientific investigation that he might employ upon the venture up the Missouri River. So in the next ensuing months, March and April predominantly, I sent Captain Lewis up to Philadelphia that he might study the areas of celestial navigation, botany, if you will, medicine, all that would be necessary to support and in order to be of service to the entire expedition, all of the soldiers that would accompany him. And so he then went up to Philadelphia, lived there for a little over a month or two, and studied with Benjamin Smith Barton, beg your pardon, and Mr. Ellicott, Andrew Ellicott in surveying, Dr. Benjamin Rush, of course, John Patterson, the chair of mathematics at the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Casper Wister, a good friend, my heavens. All of these gentlemen properly instructed Captain Meriwether Lewis in all that might be necessary once he set forth on that expedition through terra incognita, unknown land. We had no idea what lay up the Missouri River, what we might discover. And so within just a few months, Captain Lewis was well prepared to set out.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Do you recall the last time you saw Captain Lewis before he set out, and did you expect to ever see him again?
We spent the 4th of July, 1803, in the president's house. It was a delightful repast and, accompanied by so many others enjoying the anniversary of the birth. Well, the vote on our Declaration of American Independence, you could say that we were also celebrating the birth of our nation, because never forget, they are two different days. The birth of our nation was on July the 2nd. 1776. That is when we voted for independence. And remember, Mr. Adams never wants us to forget that. Let us remember every year with mass bands, bonfires, parades, illumination. But it was 2 days later, on the 4th of July, we voted on our declaration, and it appears that most Americans look upon that day as the birth of our nation. Certainly Captain Lewis did, and all of us in the president's house. It was the next morning that I saw him last. July the 5th, 1803, as he set out to Harper's Ferry. They are venturing up the Potomac River to where he could be provided with munitions to proceed further up to Fort Pitt and then down across the river, eventually the Ohio, to St. Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson, for that. People are curious. When was the last letter that you had received from the expedition before you had heard anything from them again?
This one, the one of April 7th, 1805. I wondered, well, what a wonderful treasure we have received, and yet at the same time, I looked forward to the next letter, because Captain Lewis had already informed me they would proceed on. They would make about, he thought, 25 miles a day, that they should then be approaching nearly the falls of the Missouri, and for that reason would no longer be in need of the keel boat. That's why they stopped it, if you will, at Fort Mandan to send back all of the relics. And he suggested in that last letter, not the last entirely, but the last one before I heard something from him about a year and a half later that he felt the journey would take perhaps another year. That is what he suggested and had originally been imagined by both Captain Lewis and myself. In fact, towards the end of the letter, he said, I believe that I will see you next in September 1806. Well, do you know that was nearly precise because I learned about their return to St. Louis in September 1806. And so there you are for a long period of time. We had no idea whether that expedition had actually survived. What might have happened to it? I'm not going to deny that I was concerned. But I would have to, in my high office, put my mind to much more necessary concerns for our entire nation.
Very interesting, Mr. Jefferson. So another curiosity people have is wondering what route did the Keel boat follow in order to finally arrive in Washington?
I wish I could tell you the more precisely. I know only this, that the whereabouts of the Keel boat is still in question. How far did it go? We know, of course, it proceeded all the way back down the Missouri River. It confluted with the Mississippi. It was there at St. Louis, and some say it went up to Fort Maddox on the Ohio River. Others say that it might have gone down to New Orleans. We know this much, that General Dearborn, our Secretary of War, Henry Dearborn, did inform me that many of those crates, many of the trunks, had to be opened because, well, you can imagine over several months' journeys down those rivers that, well, there might have been a great deal of vermin that had found its way inside them. Many of the contents might have become wet and soggy. And General Dearborn informed me that indeed they were opened and they were soggy. Now, not everything entirely, thank heaven, no. But there was discovered some vermin within those crates and those trunks. But thank heaven, all of the furs were fairly much in good order. All of the cages with the magpies, if you will, the barking squirrels, as some are wont to call them, or burrowing squirrels, whatever you want to suggest, they were able to arrive in good condition, though I lament. One of the magpies was deceased. So, as to what route the Keel boat took, I can only tell you we can be specific. Down the Missouri, at least to St. Louis, and there is, I would agree, far more evidence at Fort Maddox, when then all of the contents, the manifest, were then placed on shore and provided to come to the president's house in wagons.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jefferson, do you recall how you first observed the cargo of the Keel boat, and what were your expectations?
No different than what you see here in the entrance hall. No different than as I was looking over the manifest that I received along with them. Oh, I was absolutely overwhelmed with joy, exultation, to be able to see these curiosities that had never been seen by the eye of man east of the Appalachian Mountains before. To be able to see such marvelous buffalo robes, to be able to see, if you will, the antlers of the roe or the antelope. And you know, that is still debated. The antelope is not known so much in our continent, to my knowledge. And the roe, of course, is much diminutive, a much smaller deer, if you wish to call it. This is obviously a deer's antler, but the roe antler is more straight and a bit curved, branching at times. The antelope, of course, is straight up. So these were curiosities that I pondered at great length. And of course, as you may imagine, I had never seen a magpie. I had never heard a barking squirrel. So these were absolutely stupendous. And of course, as always, I was immediate to share this information with all of my good friends. I wrote immediately to the American Philosophical Society. I wrote immediately to Charles Willson Peale. As you know, he has an extraordinary museum of curiosities in Philadelphia, second floor of what is now being known as Independence Hall. So my enthusiasm My delight at this discovery, as always, I immediately share with as many as I possibly can.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We have a question from Deborah. She is curious if Meriwether Lewis used the indigenous names for the new species that he encountered, or did he assign them taxonomic names?
He assigned them names like roe and antelope and barking dog of the prairie, or burrowing dog of the prairie, or barking squirrel. Deborah, I wish I could say that Captain Lewis would have assigned to them proper scientific names as he would have learned, well, from Benjamin Smith Barton, or for others that he studied. But no, it seemed that he named them as he thought I might best understand them, and how General Dearborn might understand them. And that is all here, as I mentioned earlier, in the manifest. Look here, as I may read some of what he calls them: skins of the male and female antelope with their skeletons, two horns and ears of the blacktail or mole deer, M-U-L-E, mole deer, a marten skin came containing the skin of a weasel. So you see, all 4 buffalo robes, a carat of ricora tobacco, had specimens of plants numbered 1 to 60, the plants as best as he could describe them. Oh, here, skin of a red fox containing a magpie. And so, no, Deborah, I can tell you that this was the language of the frontier. Believe me, I refer as well to Monticello here in the wilderness as farther out west.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So, with this high number of artifacts, how long did it take to fully unload the keel boat, and what ended up happening to the boat?
Well, as I had mentioned earlier, I do not know what happened to that great keel boat. When I say great keel boat, can you imagine it? 55 feet long. I think I referred earlier to the fact that they knew they could not continue with this boat up the Missouri, particularly when they reached the falls. And were they not astounded, as I heard later, as to what they met at the falls? Can you imagine meeting up with about 5, 6, could be 7 falls, contiguous, one right after the other on the mighty Missouri? They tried to figure out a way that they could continue their journey around it. So what they discovered was essentially a pathway, a portage from where they found themselves at the east end of the Missouri, there at the falls, to the farthest west end. That portage was 17 miles. 17 miles long. Took them, I think I was told, about 3 days. I may be wrong, but I think 3 full days, could have been a bit longer, to have transported all of that on the other side. So there you are. Again, another testament to Captain Lewis of courage undaunted, along with the support of Lieutenant William Clark, that the two of them could calculate, and I'm sure there were others, soldiers of our army, absolutely astute in their intellect, to realize what they had approached and how they might proceed farther. So with that in mind, welcoming at Fort Mandan the idea to send as much as they had already accumulated back, I think was very wise. Now then, could that keel boat itself continue all of the way back? To think that even there, just below Missouri, that they should connect with the Ohio River, and to make its way all the way with a portage to the Potomac and back down to Washington City? No. They were as wise as well to decide to abandon it and then to transport the contents of the keel boat by land. So again, I wish I could tell you what happened to that. I think it would be fascinating to learn the further history of that keel boat. I would certainly welcome it and add, if you will, to the information kept in the archives of our nation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We have another question from our audience, and they're wondering, how were the animals on the trip kept alive on this journey?
Well, thank heaven they were in cages save for that poor magpie that was wrapped up in the fox's skin. No, and well, obviously that magpie was discovered within its cage to have long since shed its mortal coil. They were fed. They were fed through the cages. They fed them with what? Well, who can imagine? I'm sure with native seeds to which they were used out on the prairie. Maybe they observed that. Maybe they fed them some vegetables. I always enjoy them well cooked. Who is to say a magpie doesn't desire the same? And they might have also provided them some foodstuffs that the crew had enjoyed. So, yes, they fed the barking squirrel and the magpies. They fed them all victuals that, thank heaven, kept the majority of them alive.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. So, what was your greatest surprise discovered amongst the contents of the keel boat?
I will tell you, I have not. What surprised me most right here for us to see. But that is an enticement for you all to visit El Monticello and see still hanging on the wall of the entrance room that great display of the antlers of the wapiti. The wapiti, some call it the great elk. But I will tell you, being born and grown up in the wilderness of Western Virginia, I had never ever seen such an expanse of antlers so wide, so tall. I kept that. I'm not going to deny I kept it for myself. I sent various artifacts I mentioned earlier up to Mr. Keel in Philadelphia to the American Philosophical Society, more or less vials, if you will, of the composition of soil and certain plants. However, no, I had to keep that great elk form, and it is on display at Monticello. So there, I encourage you, rather than to simply present it to you right here, to come visit it here in the great Indian Hall at Monticello. And I hope to be equally as astounded as I was when I first unpacked that from those crates.
So, Mr. Jefferson, we've talked about a lot of the items that arrived that fared well, but were any items damaged or perhaps even completely destroyed?
Well, yes, as I mentioned earlier, the fate of the magpie, yes, certainly, and some of the artifacts were beset with water. They had gotten damp, so they were not in the same pristine condition as we had desired to receive them. I'm happy to say that most of the seeds and most of the composition of the soil remained well protected, and and yet I'm not going to deny that some of the accounts, the papers that had been brought along and placed inside of those various crates and trunks were also dampened, and the ink somewhat run and hard to read. But for the most part, no, I have to say we were rather successful in what many may refer to as a primitive method of packing that keelberg. I referred to it as the most civilized and accomplished method. To think that they were so far up the Missouri River there in the hinterlands of the Mandan peoples at what they referred to as Fort Mandan. And in review, after the return, in the proper mapping, if you will, of the Missouri River, that was their highest, most northernmost extent of their journey. Because as they proceeded on from Mandan, they began to go more southwest in their journeys, ultimately, of course, to the Great Stony Mountains, then the Snake River and the Columbia, out to the Great Western Ocean. So I'm trying to think if there's anything that has skipped my mind these years that I was sorrowful did not arrive in its greatest or most pristine form and have been otherwise completely destroyed. And I cannot think of what that may be. That's called dotage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson, for that answer. So, what happened to many of these different objects, and what did you decide to do with them? And a follow-up on this question from an audience member, Chester, is curious, how did you decide what items went where and which ones to keep?
Well, just as I had mentioned earlier, I was very quick to share my fascination of these objects with my good friends, particularly in the Athens of America. I've referred to Philadelphia before as the Athens of America, that center, if you will, of schools and education, those well read in physics and doctoring, that center of the freedom for religion, a city of churches, and the museums, if you will, and concerns as well for the pursuit of science. So that is why I immediately shared what I had received with Charles Wilson Peel and with the American Philosophical Society. As I mentioned, that I sent some of the vials of composition of soil up to Mr. Peel and to the American Philosophical Society. I also sent Mr. Peel the magpies, if you will, and the barking squirrel. Oh, was he not fascinated with that? And so they made their way to Philadelphia City. I hope to be astounding to many others that would see them. And I remember at the same time that as I had purchased several polygraphs from Mr. Peel, Mr. Peel was a good friend of Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, if you will, was the creator of the polygraph, poly meaning that you can write two letters at the same time. So this was a great advantage to me as I try to keep a copy of every correspondence that I received. And it was through Mr. Peel that I was introduced to Mr. Hawkins' creation. So I remember in my letter of instruction accompanying what I was sending him from the relic sent back by Lewis and Clark, I asked him how Mr. Hawkins was coming along with further improvements upon the polygraph, because I myself never satisfied to receive anything in its simple form, always make an effort to improve upon it and tinker with it. So I had suggested, I recall in that letter, to inform Mr. Hawkins that the nib of the pens might be the more secured to the pens, because remember, as you lift the one to write one letter, the other is accompanying it, so you write two letters at the same time. So you want to make sure that those nibs are strongly and securely affixed. That's why it is called polygraph, poly, many, graph, writing. Someone the other day said, well, Mr. Jefferson, why would you need a lie detector? I had no idea what they were referring to. I tried to remain as honest and sincere. So whatever polygraph may mean to them, I only know it is writing two letters at the same time. So you cannot lie in the one because the other will carry it through history.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. People are curious to know which objects from the cargo of the Keel boat remain at Monticello today if people wanted to come and visit.
Well, may I tell you that some of the utensils sent back in the Keel boat, the native utensils, are at Monticello to see. The great Mandan chieftain robe, the buffalo robe, richly adorned with painted scenes of Mandan victories in battle. They hang over the mezzanine railing in the entrance hall. You may see that in all of its glory. I referred, of course, to the wapiti, the elk horns that are prominent right in our entrance hall. Some of the spears that were sent back, the bow and arrow, of course. These the livelihood of our brothers, our brethren, out in the western regions of this continent. This is why I have named it the Indian Hall. It's the entrance hall, and I can only hope that we continue to maintain friendly relations with our natives. I've ensured them of this myself during my own administration as chief magistrate of this nation, when several of the Indian chieftains, accompanied by several of their own braves who were invited by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant Clark to visit me in the president's house, made their way eastward. And I greeted them there in the president's house, assured them that they might continue their journey throughout our nation, and they would not meet one fence or one wall that would prohibit their further journeys freely. And that many may visit me at Monticello, as you all are continually welcomed, that they may see proudly what I have placed to adorn the walls in my continued welcoming of all to visit, to continue sharing of information, and the continued regard, as the natives are wont to say, that we are all connected as the family of man. And so I thank you for considering what I have kept here to be of influence, not only to visitors every day, but to the future. And if not at Monticello, perhaps they may be given to the University of Virginia, that they may be given to Mr. Keel and his museum yet again, and that others may go up to the American Philosophical Society. You know, when you speak of my regard for the natives, there is a gentleman at the American Philosophical Society. I know I've mentioned him several times, but I think he is integral to remind us of our concern to preserve the legacies, the heritage, and the languages of the natives of our continent. I speak of Peter Stephen Duponchot, Monsieur Duponchot, a well accomplished attorney in Philadelphia. He and I continue to correspond in building, if you will, a foundation of the languages and etymology of various Indian languages that might be, published, let alone preserved.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, we have time for just one more question. If another boat containing unknown curiosities and objects were to be sent to you today, from what place would you be most curious to welcome them from where they've been collected? What place are you most curious about?
From every continent upon the globe, as we continue to venture westwards across our own continent, may we discover further curiosities that might be of benefit to the migration of our population westward. As we continue to enter into the interior jungles and forests of South America, which I must tell you, Alexander von Humboldt has stupefied me with the stories of his ventures throughout South America. The same throughout the continent of Africa, that I might receive, our nation may receive further relics and curiosities of the many angry African tribes and the Aborigines residing there, and anywhere across the globe, that we might continue to gather this information and share it not only amongst ourselves, but as the natives well regard, to share it with the family of man across this globe. You know, when you think that I still will bring my mortal coil to an end, not knowing any other method of transportation across this globe except upon boat, on water, and upon our own 2 feet, or on horseback, or a carriage on land, that any method we may use to enlighten ourselves further, I look forward to pursue. Who is to say, having seen the first balloon ascent, or near to it, at Versailles while I was serving our nation in France, that aeronautics someday may be a vehicle to the further enlightenment of the mind of man. Well, I will make certain that the manifest is well preserved, and that it may be a benefit to others in generations yet unborn. May they share the same excitement that I felt when I first opened up these wonders of nature.